All right. I do like to explore sewers. And I want to tell you a little bit about that. It's a lot of fun, but I also want to tell you why I think it's worthwhile. And I'm hoping that by the end of this, all of you will agree with me and you will all want to go to sewers also. So I started out going into sewers in New York City, like this one underneath Williamsburg, Brooklyn, built in 1886, the old Knickerbocker Avenue Extension sewer. At this point, I've been in sewers around the world, like this one underneath London, which was built in the great age of Victorian sewer building. It used to be the Fleet River, which ran above ground, was an important part of the city until it was put into this tunnel. I don't only go into sewers. I go into a lot of places in the urban underground, and especially if they have a good historical story attached to them. Like this old subway station, the old City Hall subway station, which was the flagship station when New York first opened up its lines in 1904. It's been abandoned since 1945. And of course, really old places are fascinating. This is part of the Paris catacombs, which started in the 11th century as limestone quarries. The stone from them built the great churches and buildings above ground, like the Notre Dame Cathedral. And in some parts, like this room, they've been decorated over the years by cataphiles, or lovers of the catacombs. And I go into new tunnels as well. This is underneath Stockholm, part of the city's utility network. Hundreds of kilometers of tunnels bored directly through the granite bedrock and holding all of the city's utilities. Also part of the official escape route for the King of Sweden if Stockholm is ever attacked. Big tunnels are fantastic. I like little tunnels as well, like this small dirt tunnel that urban archaeologists were using underneath St. Paul, Minnesota to try to get into an old brewery cellar that nobody had been into for nearly a century. So how did this start? How did I first start venturing into these tunnels? I came to New York when I was 18 years old, and I fell in love with the city. I think it's a very easy thing to do. But out of that love came a desire to see all of it, and I started poking around. And for many years, I was basically a recreational trespasser. I would go into places that were off limits because they were off limits, and because of that, there was a lot of mystery about them. I knew most people didn't get to see them. And completely unintentionally, in that process, I started learning things. So a transformative moment for me came when I started meeting people who lived underground in New York, mostly in a series of old train tunnels on the west side of Manhattan, which were abandoned at the time. These people had built homes underground. I had literally walked above them without any clue that they were there. And so it told me that there was a lot down there. There was much more beyond what I had already seen. There was much more to this city. And that actually drove me to start going up as well as down. So I started climbing up bridges, for example, the great bridges around New York. I climbed every bridge around Manhattan. This is me going up the Queensboro Bridge. And this is the view from the top. And again, quite unintentionally, I started learning things. I had this new perspective on the city, and that gave me a chance to really begin to understand things that I may have known intellectually, but I had not understood at any profound level. New York is built on islands, right? It's obvious, but when you're up at the top of one of these bridges and you see that vast expanse of water, it really comes home how much work went into bridging that gap, to recreating the environment of the city, so that now I can drive between Brooklyn and Manhattan, or take the subway and hardly even notice there's a barrier there. And it also gave me the chance to get up close and personal with these structures and to appreciate the work that went into them. The Queensboro Bridge was the most fatal of New York's bridges. Over 50 people died building it. This is the view from the top of the Brooklyn Bridge, looking out over lower Manhattan. And again, it makes it really obvious that it's built on an island. What I was seeing was infrastructure. The underlying systems and processes that make a city what it is, that create the urban environment. And beginning to see this, I became more serious about understanding it, understanding how cities work, and where all that infrastructure is, because most of it's in layers of the city that we don't normally get to see. So if you peel back the street from any city, this is all in New York, but if you did that in any city, the first thing you would see would be the spaghetti tangle of wires and pipes just beneath the street. In New York, that stuff used to be above ground. When New York was pioneering electrical distribution, they put it all on telephone poles. But there was so much of it that those started to fall over, occasionally electrocuting people, especially during the winter when ice would form and make them even heavier. So the engraving on the left is from the early 1880s. By the end of the 1880s, the city had mandated that all of that be put underground. A little bit deeper are the larger utility networks. New York also pioneered district steam heating, where a central plant will send out superheated steam so that not every building has to have its own boiler for heating. And of course, the best known tunnel network in New York is the subway system. This is one of the deeper subway tunnels where it goes underneath the river. Drains, sewers, all of these things are mixed up beneath the streets. At the very lowest level, you have water supply systems. Very important to making an urban environment work. On the upper left here is the Old Croton Aqueduct, opened in 1842, New York's first real supply of consistent drinking water. On the bottom right is a valve chamber from City Water Tunnel number 3, which is the newest and biggest of New York's water supply infrastructure. Most of it's about 600 feet beneath the surface, which makes it really hard to see, right? You can't even see directly beneath the street, and something that far down is practically invisible, so it becomes very easy to forget about these things. But I realized from the stuff that I was seeing that my normal perspective on the city was not at all a complete one. What I see from street level or what I see looking at a map. A map is two-dimensional, right? And a city is not. A city has all these layers. So this is Times Square from street level. But a better representation of Times Square would be something like this. It wouldn't be Times Square if it didn't have people. So you have to have the bridges connecting it to the mainland, and you have the subway tunnels bringing people in. You have to have electricity for the bright lights of Broadway. And then, of course, you have to have water supply, and it wouldn't be Times Square if it was flooded all the time either, so you have to have drains and sewers. All of these are constant, ongoing processes that make it what it is. And that brings me back to sewers. Seeing things like this, a mainline sewer underneath Queens, built in the 19th century, taught me two important things about how cities work. So this is from the late 19th century, but it's still the active mainline sewer, right? It's an ongoing process. It's not just a thing that is from the past and only relates to the past. It relates to the city today very much. If you build a new building anywhere in this region of Queens, it has to rely on this sewer for the toilets to flush, to avoid its basement from being flooded. So that was lesson number one that I learned. The past is not gone. It's part of the city today. And then because of that, even the pre-urban past is also part of the city today. Before this was a mainline sewer underneath Queens, it was the Sunswick Creek, which apparently had great fishing, was a water supply for people in the area. The city grew over it, it got put underground, it became part of the sewer network and something that the city today relies on, but it was shaped by that pre-urban topography of the Sunswick Creek. So the city's history itself is part of the present, and so is the pre-urban history, the natural processes. And I started seeing this everywhere I went, cities all around the world. Philadelphia had this happen quite often. There's numerous smaller rivers and large streams that were put underground, especially in the late 19th century. This is one of the largest of these tunnels, the Wingahocken Creek. If I'm saying that right, there are a lot of river names around here that are a little hard to pronounce. But this is about 24 feet high, and the inset picture just gives you a bit of a perspective on how big that is at the mouth. So how do rivers go underground? One of my favorite examples is from Moscow, the Neglinaya River. And this is the Neglinaya today flowing through the foundations of a 20th century building. But it used to be above ground. When Moscow first began to develop, it grew around the fortress of the Kremlin. That was really the seed and the origin of Moscow. And on the left-hand side, this lighter blue, that's the Neglinaya River. And on the right-hand side, the dark blue is the Moscow River. The fortress of the Kremlin was built where it is now because it's at the edge of the Moscow River, but it was able to use two branches of the Neglinaya as a moat. So this is the 16th century. By the 17th century, the city had expanded a little bit, and on the upper right, that's the Neglinaya River, and you can see bridges starting to be built across it. By the 17th century, little bits of it are already disappearing, as the city just literally grows over it with roads and buildings. Other parts of the Neglinaya have been diverted for mill ponds. By the early 19th century, most of it was underground. Only a little bit on the north and at the very southern edge before it hits the Moscow River are still visible. And this is what the Neglinaya River looks like today. Underground in tunnel, this is right before it flows underneath Red Square. It's actually also very close to the place where we had to make an emergency exit because we were afraid we were about to be flooded out. So that means it's also close to where we had to try to explain to the Russian military police why there were Americans coming out of the ground right outside Red Square. Probably a hard conversation, even if you speak Russian. So that is a relatively simple example where the city grew over the river, but the river channel essentially remained the same. Sometimes it's much more complicated, as in the case of the Minetta Brook, which is one of New York City's most famous historic streams. Greenwich Village was founded around the Minetta Brook. Today, Greenwich Village is a neighborhood in Manhattan, but at the time, it was well north of the developed city. So today, there's nothing directly following that old line, the Minetta Brook. Instead, there's a maze of sewer tunnels following the grid of the streets. So I wanted to know what happened to it. Where did it go? And so I worked with a partner on a project to map out the historic watershed and to put that over the present-day city, figure out where that all mapped out to, and then bring in the sewer grid and figure out where that water would flow, and look at the development of the city today and how it all related. And so from this, I was able to finally determine that today the Minetta Brook flows through a 12-foot wide sewer tunnel underneath Clarkson Street, if anybody's interested. I think that's pretty cool. But you might be thinking, why should I care? Why does that matter? If the Minetta Brook is just historical, what is the relevance to the city today? And you probably know what I'm going to say, that it's not just historical. It is part of the city today. This is the Minetta Brook now, or a very small part of it. The Minetta was supplied by underground springs along its entire length. And they ran into one of them when they were digging the basement at the NYU Law School, much to their surprise. So the Minetta Brook is still flowing today, and it does impact the city today, even though it's so well hidden until you dig down and run across bits of it. And this has been something that's happened over the past century and a half, ever since it disappeared from the surface. It's been a constant surprise to contractors and builders who dig down and find their foundations flooding. So this to me shows that it's nothing new that we forget our past in cities, right? It's something that has been happening throughout the growth of urban places. A much more extreme example is Los Angeles. Los Angeles has flooding issues sometimes. Now, for a long time, I thought that LA had been developed in an area that had always been a desert, and that's far from true. There used to be many streams and rivers flowing above ground year-round, much larger in the times it rained. But these are some turn of the 20th century images of areas in the old Bologna Creek watershed. Swimming hole and a section of the perennial stream. This is from 1896. This shows the streams highlighted that were still above ground in 1896. So the city developed, and when it did rain, these streams would expand a bit and flood surrounding areas. So the city decided we need to take care of that. We want to try to control that flooding. And in 1924, they built this tunnel, which was the first major storm drain or flood control project around the Bologna Creek to channel that water in. 1924, they built this. Done. Problem solved. But just 5 years later, there were new worries about catastrophic flooding. And then in the 1930s, there were several catastrophic floods. And that's kept on happening throughout the time ever since, despite huge investments in infrastructure. So this shows the construction of storm drain tunnels underneath Los Angeles between 1890 and 1980. That's a lot. This is from downtown Los Angeles westward towards the ocean. So this kind of does excite me because it tells me just how much there is in this underground layer to explore and to see. But it also raises a question, how has it happened that we've constructed all of this and flooding still goes on? And the answer in a nutshell is that each generation forgets the history that came before it. The same processes that form the rivers above ground still going on today. The rain still falls. As the city has expanded, more and more areas have become paved over. So there's actually more water that's channeled through the urban environment every time it rains. And in those concrete flood channels, the water cannot sink into the dirt as it used to. So anybody downstream is hit very hard by all this rushing flood water. And as the city expands more and more, there's always new upstream areas to send that water down. So this is why I think we should all explore sewers. When you get to see this stuff up close, it gives a profound respect for the infrastructure itself. It gives us a chance to understand what's really going on. It lets us see how the history of the environment that the city's in and the history of the city itself have gone together to shape the place we experience now. Now, I know that there are probably some people here who do not want to go wading through sewage or risk drowning in a flooded tunnel. I can appreciate that. I can respect that. So I want you to know there is another way to do it. Most manhole covers have a little tiny ventilation hole or two, and if you stick your eye down to that and you put a bright flashlight on the other ventilation hole, you can see into the underground. And yes, I know it looks a little bit crazy, but if we all do it, it won't look so crazy. Or at least I won't look so crazy when I'm doing it. And if you do look through these little holes, if you try to get a glimpse of the urban underground in any city in the world, in any urbanized area in the world, you'll start seeing the stuff that's underneath our feet all the time. You might get a glimpse down into tunnels like these. These are part of the old Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of ancient Rome, first constructed 2,700 years ago. The image on the left is one of the older sections of tunnel, and the image on the right is a section of the old cloaca that's been integrated now into the modern sewer system, so still functioning today. This drained water and sewage away from the area that became the Roman Forum, one of some of the most important real estate in the world at the time, the center of a world empire, and it was a place where men like Caesar walked. This tunnel is underneath Caesar's palace. But it's more than 2,000 years later, and it's underneath Caesar's Palace Casino in Las Vegas. And in both cases, they do exactly the same thing, right? They prevent people and property from being washed away every time it rains. In both cases, they're massive, amazing infrastructure projects. And in both cases, they're almost always invisible. If we have the chance to see these spaces, we can appreciate the history of the city, we can appreciate the projects that have been done in the past. Cities shape their environment, and the way they do that is through infrastructure. But they are also shaped by their environment. The processes that form rivers and streams in the natural environment still go on. In cities, rain still falls, underground springs still flow, like this underground spring forcing its way into a sewer underneath Queens. So if we pay attention to how this all works and we can appreciate the infrastructure that has made our cities what they are today, I think it empowers us to know that we can continue to pay attention to how it all really works, and we can continue to shape our cities in the future into whatever we want them to be. Thank you.